about the entrepreneur for social change. And indeed, you have, in a way, started introducing our next speaker, who will go in more detail in explaining one of these initiatives. And the next speaker, I have the pleasure to introduce Ms. Rawan Kashkoush, who is the social entrepreneur on urban planning and the founder of Benchmark, which is an initiative of social inclusion taking place in Amman. Ms. Kashkoush, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Sheldon. Thank you for turning that on. Thank you, everyone. Mr. President, Your Excellencies, distinguished guests, good morning. It is an honor to be here today to celebrate a global awakening in the potential within our existing structures to build a democratic landscape. Our public arena mirrors the value systems we have within ourselves and within our communities. But do they speak of who we are and who we will become? Now, the professor of anthropology, David Harvey, states the right to the city is far more than the right to the individual access of resources that a city embodies. Instead, it is the right to change ourselves by changing the city. Now, I am half Palestinian, half Kuwaiti. I have a Lebanese passport. My father's family was forced to leave Palestine because of the Israeli occupation, and so he spent the most of his life relocating throughout the MENA region, trying to find a home for himself, often temporary, until he decided to ground me in a place that he found home, Amman. I'm very proud of that. It's a familiar story and one of thousands. Now, the last decade has seen an acceleration of the socio-political fabric in the Middle East to weave itself into migrant knots strewn about its landscapes. And Jordan has seen successive waves of migrants. We're talking about Palestine, Syria, Lebanon, Iraq, Egypt, all collecting at its doorstep. Resources are already wrung with attempts to support the existing population. I'm sure we're all familiar. And reluctant host communities struggle to produce a situation better than temporary for those newcomers. Now, the pattern of incorporating new cultures into the capital itself has created a kind of physical identity for Amman. It has been coined by an incredible gentleman and architect named Mohammed al-Assad, a story of severe discontinuities and harsh ruptures. Now, what fuels the predictable polarization in a city like this? You have multi-identities. In my experience over the last 20 years of knowing the city, its people has shown that the economic boom, urban transformation, have been segregated by the zoning, which simply does not take into account the social health. Now, the undulating topography of Amman reinforces the disconnectedness of the city. As new neighborhoods populate the hills and commercial areas fill the valleys in between, our bias towards high-speed mobility has resulted in large thoroughfares or massive roads that bisect the city in order to shuttle cars from one point to another, completely dividing the urban fabric like dams, marginalizing pedestrianism, and consequently isolating communities. Now, everyone's familiar with the situation in the Arab world. It's characterized by a large youth population under the age of 25. 60% of the population is such. In Jordan, there's also nepotism, favoritism, unemployment rates are ridiculous, and it's creating a lack of hope in the promising future for the youth, brewing instead increasing apathy towards civic engagement and any kind of activism. What do we learn of the available public spaces in Amman? I was asking a friend of mine, who has access to these public spaces? A young woman whom I asked, how often do you go outside? How often do you go to your public space? And I look at her and I realize, wow, she's wearing a veil that was invisible before I'd asked the question. And she says, I'm not allowed to drive after sunset. You know, the nearest park I can access is by car. How am I supposed to get there? And even if I do arrive, how many women do you think will be there? Polarization, youth apathy, and gender inequality. Basic concepts we're familiar with in my region. Now, how can we increase social integration? How can we increase tolerance? How can we improve the standard of living? And this is where I introduced my social entrepreneurship. I have a short example of something that I witnessed in my neighborhood. There's a small, humble park to which only 12 people used to frequent. Then, with the war that has taken place in Syria, many have fled, and those who could have come to my nearby neighborhood. The nation's first weekend day, Friday, now has 145 people visiting this park, which is an incredible increase. The majority of the park goers are Syrian, right, but it's inspired a more frequent visitation from the locals. And this is what I think is incredible. You see the park alive with gathered families. Now, William White, the urbanist, I'm sure many are here familiar with him, the writer of The Social Life of the Small Urban Spaces, has offered the world exhaustive research on the matter of how to draw people to public space and how to make them want to stay. He undertones his research with a basic precedent. People like to sit where there are places for them to sit. Now, in my opinion, what happened in Amman is that the Syrians came to the park, they sat, and what draws people to public space is people. This space now acts as a cultivator for social friction. I offer a term I learned a little while ago called placemaking, and I'd like to define it now. Placemaking fosters civic connections and builds social capital, ultimately facilitating the interaction to improve societal development. Placemaking empowers people by rooting them in the process of building useful public space. Now, integrating people within their cities as authorities rather than afterthoughts. The importance of the process far precedes the product. We're awarding the citizens stewardship on the path to results. And that's where my project comes in. It's called Benchmark. It's a placemaking initiative looking to address some of the aforementioned issues. And the enterprise looks to target citizens directly to access their personal experiential expertise of their own neighborhoods. We're talking about people on the ground who know the place better than any urban planners. We're talking about people who live in these areas and interact with people that are side by side, who they're completely alienated from. The objective of this concept is to build an environment that invites people to engage with their city and consequently with one another. The intention is to penetrate the growing alienation from one's own neighbor, which I've said before. Now, how does it work? So specific locations within the city are absorbed by the participants, obviously having potential to transform them from negligible into meaningful. The location is then pinned onto an interactive map accessible online by the public. This becomes an open source platform and a forum for discussion, an analysis for community members to discuss what ails them, what is appealing to them within their own neighborhoods. Now, Benchmark also provides a crowdfunding infrastructure to begin with a basic building block, let's say, for example, the bench. So people that are putting together their money to have some sort of ownership over the public arena. The bench is locally produced and site-specific, and obviously it can be dedicated to someone, a loved one as well. But the point is that you have ownership, and it's with your own money that you can see some kind of change taking place. The result is a thesis of collective urban analysis, a map of a city peppered with intimate interactions between citizen and space. The ambition to encourage a state of autonomous guardianship of one's built environment by providing them ownership. The engagement of volunteers is to observe the unrecognized pockets, displaying the perspective of multiple communities and their chosen places of gathering. But what might we learn also of the spaces that are left alone? The unattractive spaces, the places and spaces that are unattended to. I personally am curious to see a reflection of the current society of Amman in the built environment. I want to see a mirroring of the textures of the identities that exist today in Amman, resulting in an architecture of community. Our realm must inform us of who we are. So my confidence is in collective engagement, in crowdsourcing, in crowdfunding. Support the citizens with platforms to express and share ideas for urban transformation. Empower the citizens by giving them the authority to effect change. Provide the citizens with raw materials, if possible, to bring about this change, but most importantly, consider the citizens. I've only just completed the workshop in Torino for the Entrepreneurs for Social Change, and I've been afforded a toolkit to make this project come about and to actually come to fruition, and for that I am very grateful. It's also one of the reasons why I'm here today, because of the collaboration between the Nations Alliance of Civilisations and Fondazione CRT. I would just like to say on a final note that in my taxi ride on the way to the airport in Amman, from Amman to New York, I asked my taxi driver, and I will say his name, Abdulrahman Al-Qasir, if he wanted to take part in building his own public space with the help of his neighbors. And his eyes light up, and he says, of course, for my children to have a place they call their own. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ms. Kashkoush, and thank you for bringing us the concept of placemaking and benchmarking and talking about how to increase social integration and increase the sense of belonging by rooting people in the process of building useful public space. Now I